Hi there, I'm Rob Stavins, a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar for an update on climate change policy. As some of you know, in addition to being a professor here at the school, I'm the director of the Harvard Environmental Economics program and the Harvard Project on Climate Agreement. Some of you may have been with us last year, and if you were, we've got some new material that I think you'll find interesting because this world of climate change policy is rapidly evolving. So here's what I'd like to talk with you about for the next 45 minutes or so, after which, by the way, we're going to take questions, and I hope in the meantime, if you have questions, there is a chat space where you can type in your questions. I'm going to start by commenting on how it is that the natural science takes us to the economics and then to the geopolitics in terms of our analysis, and then turn to what's very important from an economic and a policy perspective, which is the notion of putting a price on carbon. That will form the basis for what will be the bulk of our discussion, which is going to be an update on international climate change policy, as well as on U.S. climate change policy. Even with the current administration, there are important developments, and so we certainly want to include those. And then I'll conclude, and we'll turn to your questions and some discussion that we'll have. So to start, something that's striking is in this environmental sphere that we're never able to start with the politics or with the economics. We really do have to start with the natural science. And there are two elements of the natural science of climate change which are exceptionally important. The first is a spatial dimension, and that is that greenhouse gases mix in the atmosphere. So therefore, the location of the emissions has no effect on the impacts. It doesn't matter if the emissions come from Cambridge, Massachusetts, London, England, or Beijing in China. The impact in terms of climate change will be the same because the emissions then are mixing in the atmosphere. In economic terms, this means that climate change is a global commons problem. Any jurisdiction that takes action, whether that jurisdiction is a region such as Europe, a country such as Korea, or a state such as California, any jurisdiction that takes action will incur the costs of taking action, and those costs are essentially the costs of shifting from coal to petroleum to natural gas and the generation of electricity and other forms of energy, the costs of increasing energy efficiency. All of those costs will be borne by the jurisdiction that's taking action, but the climate benefits will be distributed globally because the greenhouse gases are mixing. And therefore, importantly, for virtually any jurisdiction, the direct climate benefits it reaps from its actions are going to be less, indeed much less, than the costs that it incurs, despite the fact that the global benefits may be greater, indeed probably much greater than the global costs. This presents a classic free rider problem. It is in the interest of every jurisdiction to not take action, but to reap benefits from the action of others. That way you get the benefits, but you avoid the costs. And because of this, it is necessary that international, although not necessarily global, but international cooperation be present. That's not the case for many other environmental problems in which countries or even provinces or states or cities or towns can take action on their own because they pay the costs and they get the benefits. Not that way with climate change. International cooperation is essential. So that's the spatial dimension of the science to the economics to the geopolitics. There is also a temporal dimension that takes us from the science to the economics to the politics and policy. And that is that greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere. In the case of one very important greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, that comes from the combustion of fossil fuels, that remains in the atmosphere for over 100 years before precipitating out. And the damages of climate change are a function of the stock that's in the atmosphere, not the flow at any point in time. In other words, this is if we have a bathtub. The flow is the water coming into the tub, and we have a very slow drain so that the level of the tub is constantly increasing. And the damages, in the case of climate change, are a function of the level of the tub, that is, the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So the most severe consequences of climate change are going to be in the long run. But climate change policies and the attendant costs of mitigation, of cutting emissions, those are incurred immediately. Those are upfront. This combination of upfront costs and greatly delayed benefit presents a tremendous political challenge. Because in representative democracies, as you know, the political incentive is very much to give benefits to voters today, and if anything, to place the costs on future generations. The climate problem asks politicians to do precisely the opposite. So together, the spatial issue I mentioned, the global commons nature of the problem, plus this intertemporal asymmetry, make climate change an extremely tough political challenge. It's for that reason, by the way, that rather than condemning governments when they don't take action, I think it's reasonable to understand why many governments don't take action, because political international cooperation is required. This also suggests why economics can help with the design of better public policies, to take account of this global commons nature of the problem and to take account of this intertemporal asymmetry. So let me start, therefore, from an economic perspective by talking about putting a price on carbon. And I'm going to comment both on the motivation for this, what the current status is in the world of putting a price on carbon, and then also look at a stylized view, or what are the consequences of pricing carbon. So policy analysts around the world, not just economists, tend to favor carbon pricing as a means of addressing the problem. And when I say carbon pricing, I'm referring principally to one of two policy instruments: carbon taxes or cap and trade. Carbon taxes are essentially placing a tax on the carbon content of one of the three fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, or natural gas. And a cap and trade system could be a carbon rights trading, which itself would bring about a price of that scarce commodity, the rights themselves. Now, why is it that there's so much support from policy analysts for carbon pricing? It's not ideological. It's not simply because economists or others like the notion of using the market. Rather, it's for a very specific set of reasons. The first is feasibility. There is no other feasible approach that could provide meaningful emissions reductions. And when I say this, when I say meaningful emissions reductions, what I have in mind are the political targets that are under the Paris Agreement that we're going to talk about later. Also, what is the international political objective of cutting emissions by something on the order of 80% by the year 2050. That's what I mean by meaningful emissions reductions. And why is it that there's no other feasible approach? For other environmental problems, we use performance standards. We tell individual sources, firms, companies, how much they can emit. Or we tell them what technology they should use. We tell automobile companies, for example, to put a catalytic converter on the exhaust system of the car. But there's a problem here. The problem is that for those other problems, the number of sources, such as in the case of electricity generation, we're talking about hundreds or thousands, sometimes 10,000 sources. In the case of carbon dioxide emissions, we're talking not just about every electrical fossil fuel generating facility, but every manufacturing plant, every commercial facility, every residence, every motor vehicle, every lawnmower, every backyard barbecue grill, on and on and on. We're talking about millions, indeed hundreds of millions of sources in a large industrialized countries such as the United States, for example. And so we're talking about hundreds of millions of decisions made on a daily basis. It is absolutely impossible to affect all of those through those performance standards or technology standards. Rather, signals need to be sent. And what signaling can be done is best done through the market, because that's what markets do. They send signals of relative scarcity. So on feasibility grounds, carbon pricing is really the only feasible approach. But there are also two economic reasons. The second is that this is the least costly approach in the short term, because the incremental, or as economists say, the marginal cost of reducing emissions varies tremendously across sources. And only if all sources are at the same marginal cost is the overall target being achieved in the least costly way. Otherwise, we could simply shift some of the emissions reduction burden from a high-cost controller to a low-cost controller and lower costs. The only time at which costs can no longer be lowered in that way is when everyone is at the same marginal cost. Carbon taxes or cap-and-trade carbon pricing do precisely that. They provide incentives for all sources to be at the same marginal cost of control. And then there's the long-term issue. Looking at what scientists say is going to be necessary in terms of emissions reductions are going to mean tremendous reductions in the future, which cannot be brought about simply by diffusion of existing technologies, but will require innovation and invention, indeed, of new technologies. That's going to require long-term price signals. And again, that takes us back to carbon pricing. Now let me say a word about what the current status is of carbon pricing in the world. Not all jurisdictions by any means use carbon pricing, but there are an increasing number that are using cap-and-trade systems as one of the two principal forms of carbon pricing. This includes in the European Union, its emissions trading system, in New Zealand, in the Northeast United States, in California, Quebec, Korea, Ontario, and beginning approximately in the year 2020, what will become the world's largest emissions trading system, actually a tradable performance standard system, in China. That's a substantial number, but there are also situations and countries of the world where carbon taxes and related energy taxes are used. Now, you'll notice that I gave dollar amounts for the cap-and-trade allowance prices from the market, but I'm not giving dollar amounts for the taxes. And that's because many of these taxes are not carbon taxes per se, but rather they're energy taxes, or they contain many exemptions for different sectors. So it's difficult to say what the actual implicit carbon tax is. Many of these are at very low levels, but there are exceptions to that, and those are the first few. Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries, where the carbon taxes are at very significant levels indeed, and you'll see these in a moment graphically. But there are also many other jurisdictions that are not going to employ carbon pricing, but will indeed use performance or technology standards, which, as I said, will be less cost effective than carbon pricing. They'll produce muted or distorted price signals, but nevertheless there is an implicit price on carbon. There's still a marginal cost of reducing carbon, hence in the language of economics, a shadow price on carbon. So here's a graph that gives us a sense of the current coverage of cap-and-trade systems in green and carbon taxes in blue. So on the vertical axis, what we have is the carbon price, whether that's the allowance price in a cap-and-trade system or the tax in a carbon tax system. And then the horizontal axis shows the amount of coverage that there is. And as you can see at the far right, the total coverage currently accounts for about 14% of global CO2 equivalent emissions. By CO2 equivalent, I mean both carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases, but all translated into CO2 units. So what's striking from this is that you can see that most of these are at a fairly low level in terms of dollar amounts, but that there are some carbon taxes at the far right which are very severe. Those are, again, the ones from Northern European, from Scandinavian countries. But also take note of there's a lot more green than blue, the overall mass, so that there's actually more action right now from cap-and-trade systems as opposed to carbon tax systems. Personally, I think that's likely to continue, but we actually can't say for sure. What we can say is that approximately in the year 2020, that China is going to launch its cap-and-trade system, which they're actually developing currently. And China, remember, accounts for about 30% of global CO2 emissions. So if China's national emissions trading system eventually regulates half of its emissions, which is what they aspire to get to eventually, then that's going to double the coverage. And so in this graph, what you would see is that the horizontal axis, the far right, would go twice as far out to the right as it does currently, but it would do so by putting a big block of green right in the middle for the Chinese system. Now let's take a look at what the consequences are of carbon pricing. First of all, for the fossil fuel named coal. Coal is where we're going to see the greatest impacts globally, and that's due to the high carbon content of coal per unit of energy that it has within it in terms of BTUs. So, for instance, if we were talking about coal use for electricity generation, which is the primary but not the only use of coal around the world, then if the price of coal goes up, we would see three things happen. One would mean immediate impacts on electricity dispatch. That is less sending of coal into the electricity grid, coal-fired power, and more sending of natural gas-fired power, possibly oil-fired power in some countries, and renewable power into the grid. And then in the longer term, we would see reductions in investment in new capacity for coal if the carbon price was at an elevated level, therefore affecting tremendously the cost of generating electricity with coal. We'd also expect to see impacts on the retirement, that is, earlier retirement of existing capacity. The second fossil fuel to take note of is natural gas, which is increasingly important in many parts of the world. Now here the impacts are much smaller because of the lower carbon content of natural gas compared with coal. And here, although you would anticipate to see a decrease in natural gas, although not as dramatic as coal, in the short term, we could actually expect to see an increase in demand for natural gas, as we are seeing, and that's because of substitution of natural gas for coal. This has been extremely important in the United States, is potentially important in parts of Europe and in China, and for that matter, in other parts of the world. The key issue here is that the effects of carbon pricing up till now in bringing about the substitution of natural gas for coal and electricity generation, the effect has not been so much due to carbon pricing, but it's rather been due to exogenous effects in the economy of two technologies combined. One is horizontal drilling for natural gas, also for oil, and hydraulic fracturing. The two together are often referred to as fracking. And that combination of fracking has lowered tremendously the cost of producing natural gas, therefore has lowered the price of natural gas, and that has led to a shift, for example, in the United States, where we were at approximately 60 to 40 as the ratio of coal to natural gas generation not very many years ago. We flipped that now on its head where it's 40-60. The third and final of the three fossil fuels, of course, is petroleum or oil. And here there would be potentially significant impacts, but at least in the short term and the medium term, they're likely to be muted. And the reason is that although in the case of coal and natural gas, for electricity, there are clear substitution effects, substitution potential. In the case of the transportation sector, where so much of oil goes in the form of liquid fuels, the possibilities for substitutes are currently much more limited. I'm not saying they're non-existent, but they're much more limited. And therefore, there's a relatively high marginal CO2 abatement cost. And so, in the short term, a cost-effective portfolio of reducing CO2 emissions would actually target the transportation sector less, which is what we see in most parts of the world where, in fact, climate policies have been put into effects. The effects on oil markets will take place, but these are largely going to be through overall suppression of demand due to increases in energy efficiency that themselves are partly a result of increases in the price of oil and therefore derivatives such as gasoline. In the long term, we would anticipate introduction of substitutes in this sector as well. Now, the economic impacts are going to vary across sectors and also across regions. In terms of fuels and energy generation, as I said, this is certainly going to be bad news, holding everything else constant for the coal generation, for the coal sector, even in the short term, a mixed picture for natural gas, and possibly muted for oil. But certainly very good news for non-fossil fuels, that is, for renewables, principally for wind power and solar power, and possibly for nuclear, although again this depends on many other factors because the cost of nuclear itself has been quite high, partly but not exclusively due to the difficulty of siting new nuclear facilities. Now, for other sectors, such as in manufacturing, we would really have to go through it sector by sector, industry by industry, and company by company. But there is a simple rule of thumb that's helpful to think about, and it's in two parts. First, increased energy prices are going to be bad news for all sectors that use energy. Well, that means all sectors of any economy because all sectors use energy. But there will be differences because it can be good news for producers of energy-consuming durable goods. For an example of this would be producers of commercial aircraft for the airliners. So I give here the example of Boeing, but we could also take note of Airbus in Europe. So when the price of jet fuel goes up, remember, the cost of jet fuel is the most important variable cost that airlines face. In a given year, whether commercial airlines are earning profits or incurring losses is almost always a function of the price of jet fuel. So when the price of jet fuel goes up, what does that mean? It means that the airlines have an incentive to buy more energy efficient aircraft. Indeed, that's the reason. That's the reason why commercial airlines buy new aircraft. It's not because they want to have blue lights in the ceiling rather than white lights. It's because they want to save on the cost of jet fuel. And the newer generations of aircraft are more energy efficient. And by the way, they're not, for the most part, more energy efficient because of more efficient engines, that is drivetrains, although the new generation of engines are somewhat more efficient. It's largely because of the fact that the new generation of commercial aircraft are lighter. They're just as strong, they're just as safe, but they're lighter because of more use of composite materials rather than heavy metals of the traditional manufacturing. So when the price of jet fuel goes up, there's a more rapid turnover of the capital stock. Airlines start buying new jet aircraft. Good news for Boeing, good news for Airbus. But that also tells us that this increase in energy prices is particularly bad news for those consumers of the energy-consuming durable goods. I give the example here of Singapore Airlines, but it's also United Airlines. It's also Lufthansa, any airline, because it's bad news for them because it's increasing their cost. Now, I've used the example of aircraft manufacturers and airlines, but this is true across the board. So if you think back and you want to explain why it is that some industries tend to be supportive of more stringent climate policies and other sectors of the economies tend to be less stringent, this is not just a matter of the airline industry. It's much broader. And if you want to explain why it is some sectors support climate policies, some sectors, some firms don't, this explains a lot of it. So if you go back to the time at which a major climate policy was being considered in the United States, the Waxman-Markey legislation, a nationwide cap-and-trade system, well, who supported it? Well, the lead of a coalition was General Electric Corporation. They produce energy-consuming, durable goods. So Boeing was supportive of it. Also, automobile manufacturers were supportive. Also, Caterpillar, the manufacturers of off-road and construction equipment, they were supportive. So a lot of the political economy explanation of why some companies support climate policies, some don't, are actually due to the very factor that we're looking at here. Now, having said that, I want to remind us that this is a global commons problem, and so international cooperation is absolutely necessary. So let me turn to international climate change policy. The Paris Climate Agreement from December 2015 is a landmark climate accord. It represents a dramatic departure from the previous 20 years. We can talk about that in Q&A if you like. And it really does provide a foundation for moving forward, I think, in a progressive and ultimately effective way. But whether it's ultimately successful, whether emissions are brought down, is something that I don't know. No one knows at this point. But what we can say is that one of two key necessary conditions has been met: adequate scope of participation, whereas the Kyoto Protocol in its current second commitment period includes countries that account for 14% of global CO2 emissions. The Paris Agreement includes countries that account for 97% of global CO2 emissions. If the United States does drop out of the agreement, which would not be until 2020, but if it does, that 97% falls to 85%. But that's still a big improvement over the 14%. But there's another key necessary condition, and that's adequate ambition of the policies, plus, of course, successful implementation. This has meant that there's a huge opportunity and a need for creative thinking and analysis. And I'm very pleased to say that at Harvard and the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, we've been working with an international team, 75 research initiatives in countries around the world, doing research on various aspects of climate agreements and national domestic climate policies. And we're also heavily engaged in typical Kennedy School fashion in outreach with governments, with private industry, with NGOs, working at the annual climate negotiations and other venues. Just as one example of the kind of work we're doing in outreach, we held a workshop at Harvard last July in which we looked at a whole set of issues that are important going forward under the Paris Climate Agreement. And then we proceeded to go to Asia, to Shanghai, and then to Bonn at the annual negotiations to talk about these. Indeed, in about a month, I'm going to be going back to China and to Korea to continue the process of communication and learning, for that matter, on implementation issues, key ones under the Paris Agreement. But national policies are key, because the direct impacts of the Paris agreements will be trivial. Rather, the way in which the Paris Agreement has effects is by inducing individual countries, the parties to the agreement, to take action. And that includes potentially the United States. So therefore, let me turn to conclude to U.S. climate change policy. And I'll start by commenting on the state of domestic climate change policy in the age of Trump. Now, as you may know, back in 2013 and since then, the current president has said global warming is a total and very expensive hoax. So no one should have been surprised that when he came into office, together with the Congress, which both houses, the upper and lower, are of the same political party, have made significant efforts to roll back environmental regulations, in particular climate change policies. I won't take time now to go through the whole list of everywhere where attempts are being made, in some cases successfully, to roll back climate change policies. But if you'd like to talk about any of these, then please write down a question and we can certainly do that. Rather, I want to recognize that there is an important caveat. And the caveat is that it's non-trivial in the United States to change federal laws and regulations. So my view is that the administrator of EPA, Mr. Pruitt, is likely to make cuts at EPA with a scalpel rather than with an axe. In many cases, repealing a regulation actually requires a new regulation. That requires a scientific and economic analysis to support the new regulation. It requires a 90-day comment period in which hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of comments come in that have to be responded to. And many regulations are actually required by laws, by statutes, and those are much harder to change. Also, some federal and all state-level climate policies are going to remain and even be strengthened. So there are wind and solar tax credits in the U.S. that were extended in December 2015. These are very important for the diffusion of wind and solar power in the U.S. There is bipartisan support for these across the political parties because elected officials love to give out benefits. They just don't like to give out costs. Then in the state of California, there's a very ambitious climate policy that is now extended to the year 2030. It's essentially economy-wide. It has as one of its features, but not the only, a cap-and-trade system. And then in the electricity sector in the Northeast, there's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So in general, in the United States, it's fair to say that subnational action is going to be increasingly important over at least, well, no longer the next 4 years, the next 2.5 years until the next general election for the presidency and the Congress then. Let me turn finally to international dimensions of climate change policy in this age of Trump. Again, with a quote. Back during the campaign in May of 2016, the president said, "I will cancel the Paris Climate Agreement," which of course no individual government can do, "and stop all payments of U.S. tax dollars to UN global warming programs," which the president can do and more or less has done. What's the consequences of the Trump presidency for international climate policy? Well, one thing that's quite ironic is that I think we ought to really thank the Trump presidency for the Paris Agreement coming into force, because the Paris Agreement had in it a requirement that would come into force only when 55% of countries, representing 55% of global emissions, had ratified the agreement. It took 7 years for that to happen with the Kyoto Protocol, and it was anticipated that it would take the same amount of time, if not longer, with the Paris Agreement. But countries of the world recognize something else, namely the Paris Agreement provides that once it comes into force, there is a 4-year delay before any country can withdraw. It has to wait 3 years before initiating withdrawal, and it takes 1 year more to make it complete. Therefore, as countries around the world recognize the possibility of there being a Trump administration elected, countries moved much, much, much faster than was anticipated to ratify the agreement, and indeed, it came into force when 55% requirement was hit in November of 2016. So for that reason, it is absolutely reasonable to say that it is because of the Trump administration, that is, fear of a potential Trump administration, that the Paris Climate Agreement has come into force in the space of just 1 year after it was originally put in place, as opposed to the 7-year delay we had with Kyoto. But it's certainly the case that the U.S. target is not going to be met. Of course, it also would not have been met had Mrs. Clinton been elected president. Now, the options for the U.S. administration were threefold. One is that the U.S. administration, the president could withdraw from the Paris Agreement. It would require a 4-year delay, as I said. Or they could actually withdraw for the overall umbrella agreement, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that would be an even more drastic move, but ironically would require only a 1-year delay. But that was signed by President George H.W. Bush. It was ratified on a unanimous voice vote by the U.S. Senate. So that seemed an unlikely approach. The third possibility, which many of us thought would be the best for this administration to take, given that the options in its position, would be to remain in the Paris Agreement, but to revise its individual pledge, if you will, its nationally determined contribution. It could have done that and still achieved whatever it wanted to achieve. But the decision that was announced in June of 2017 was in fact to withdraw from the agreement. But again, remember, that won't be effective until November 2020. Indeed, I think it's 2 days after the next general election. In the meantime, the U.S. continues to be a party to the Paris Agreement. I'll tell you that when I was in Bonn recently at the international climate negotiations, a number of the negotiating teams from other countries commented to me how surprised they were and pleased they were that the U.S. negotiating team, which is made up of civil servants, it's not at a political appointee level now, of civil servants, was still engaged and engaged constructively. So that process has continued. Whether it will continue going forward, of course, I can't say. So the most important effect, though, really, of this new U.S. position is not on domestic U.S. CO2 emissions, because that has to do with domestic policy, which we've already talked about. Nor is it about what's going to happen in terms of the U.S. participating itself, because that's a 4-year delay. The most important effect immediately would be what's its impact on the other key countries. Now, the European Union is not going to become less ambitious because of U.S. withdrawal. If anything, they would probably become more ambitious. So the key question is, what would be the effect on the large emerging economies? Because that's where the growth in emissions is. In China, India, Brazil, Korea, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia. The initial signs have been quite comforting. So China seems to be very happy to have gone from joint leadership together with the United States to what is sole leadership. And China has been aggressive with that and is continuing to do that. And I'm pleased to say that in the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, in addition to working with many parts of the world, many countries, we have a new initiative that was approved by the Harvard Global Institute from President Drew Faust just a few days ago, which will be a new initiative in China and a new initiative in India. So this is going to be particularly important going forward. So what's really important then is that for the other parties of the Paris Agreement, for them to, I hope, think of U.S. actions not as defined by the U.S. federal government, but as defined more broadly by the U.S. geographically, because of the importance of subnational action. Now, the subnational action we have doesn't make up for federal action by any means, but it's a very important contributor nevertheless. So key questions now that we're working on actually on our research in the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements is how can subnational policies and achievements be recognized under the Paris Agreement? This is a very important issue, and this may turn out to be a key issue for the months ahead and, for that matter, even the years ahead. So let me conclude by saying that the economic impacts of climate change policies are, for the reasons I've said, likely to exceed the economic impacts of unabated climate change in the short term. And when we talk about climate change, the short term can be 10 to 20 years. The Paris Climate Agreement directly affects the countries of the world, 187 signatories. The policy actions that we're going to see are going to be very diverse, and they are, in terms of stringency and in terms of form. And some are going to be at the regional level, such as in the European Union. Some is at most at the national level. And then in the United States, it'll be very important what's happening at the subnational level. As I've shown you, the economic impacts are going to vary both geographically and sectorally. but some generalizations and rules of thumb point to particularly sensitive industries. Something that I haven't talked about, but is surely the case, is that the economic benefits of climate change will also be very, very significant of climate change policies. In other words, there will be substantial economic damages of unabated climate change. Indeed, we anticipate that the economic benefits of climate change policies would actually be greater, certainly in the long term, than the cost of those policies. But an important thing to think about is that the economic benefits of climate change policies tend to be more diffuse geographically than the cost impacts, which are focused on particular sectors of economies. That presents a third, yet another political challenge, which is why this is such a difficult political, economic problem, and as I've said, ultimately geopolitical challenge. There's an opportunity that some of you are aware of, I hope, and I hope others will take note of, and that's to learn more about climate change and energy policy through executive education at Harvard. We are going to be running our third annual edition of Climate Change and Energy Policy Making for the Long Term from October 15th to 20th here at the Harvard Kennedy School. The program is going to provide insight into climate change policy from a variety of perspectives: the natural science, the economics, political science, international relations, even engineering, and certainly policy. Harvard faculty conducting research on climate and energy are going to lead session together with some superstars of faculty from other universities who will be joining it. And I'm very pleased to say that for the third year, I will be the faculty chair of the program. I'll be teaching some of the sessions. I'll be present and hosting all of the sessions and will be with the students throughout the week. So if you'd like to learn more or apply, the best thing to do is to contact the program director, Caitlin Marquidont. Here's her email address as well as her phone number, or you can visit the website of the program, which is also on your screen. This information is also on the webinar website itself and is going to be in a follow-up email that Ms. Marquidont is going to send to all of you. So I think with that, let me say one final thing, and then we're going to turn to your questions. So please do now type in your questions. The last thing I want to say is that I've gone through a lot of material. In addition to taking the course, before you come to the course, if you'd like to learn more about any of this, here's the website of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, the website of the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, my own website where everything I've written since I was in kindergarten or pictures I've drawn since I was in kindergarten are available as PDF files for free downloading. My blog, which many of you I know subscribe to, or of course I hope you'll follow me on Twitter. And so with that, I'd love to turn to your questions. The first question is, what are particular challenges that are brought up by the current U.S. administration on climate change? Well, as I've said, the challenges are significant, but if I may say so, like in so many areas with this administration, the greatest challenges are in terms of the rhetoric, not the reality. Yes, climate change policies are being turned back or being rolled back in the U.S., but not nearly as much as you would think from just listening to what's being said. Likewise, at the international level, the administration's announcement, the president's announcement that he's going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement is very serious, but again, it's not going to be implemented, if it is at all, until 3.5 years from now in November of 2020. Second question, am I optimistic or pessimistic about the future of climate change negotiations? I guess I am cautiously optimistic, and that's because we've got the building blocks for an effective approach going forward. We have the right scope of participation, this 97% or at least 85%. With the Kyoto Protocol approach of 14% of global emissions covered, and none of the countries where the increases in emissions taking place being included in that coalition, that was never going to work. So this new approach can work, but whether it will is something we're only going to know over the years ahead when we look at the aggregate ambition of the nationally determined contributions from the individual member countries. So next question, what do I believe to be the biggest challenge in the energy sector today, and what should be the priority? Well, challenges to the energy sector vary tremendously across countries. Big differences between the industrialized world and the developing world. There are some challenges that are common. One of them is certainly going to be decarbonizing, what we're talking about. That's going to be important in all countries. Now, there are parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, mired in poverty, very low levels of CO2 emissions that don't even really need to be part of the coalition of action in the short term. But in the large emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, Korea, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, in the industrialized world, in other words, all of the OECD countries, that's where reducing the carbon intensity of energy production is going to be extremely important. But let's acknowledge the fact that in some parts of the world, I'll take India as an example, where such a large part of the population mired in poverty, no access to electricity, that broadening access to electricity to that form of energy itself is very important. In other parts of the world, reliability of electricity supply is extremely important. So we really have to look at it differentiated, which is why, by the way, in the executive program course, we give very careful attention to the situation in developing countries as opposed to the industrialized world. We look at both because the situations can be very different. So next question, what is the basis for defining national contributions under the Paris Agreement? And is there any bearing between the national contribution and the target emission? So the basis for determining the national contributions is completely independent and up to each country. The approach that's taken under the Paris Agreement, this is a hybrid of top-down and bottom-up. The nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, are bottom-up. It's on what each country believes is politically feasible to do, technically feasible to do, what it thinks it's fair for it to do. So each country on its own comes up with its own nationally determined contribution. It carries out analysis, and then it says what it's going to do. How do those add up? For example, to stabilizing the current set of them, to stabilizing temperatures at 2 degrees centigrade? Absolutely not. So there will be a stock taking periodically under the Paris Agreement to see what the cumulative is of all of the targets and of the achievements. And then every 5 years under the Paris Agreement, the parties, that is the countries, will update their NDC with an eye to making it more stringent. So given that, next question, given that most stock exchanges are composed of a large share of carbon-intensive publicly traded company, what would gradual divestiture look like? How can the transition be managed at a pace to prevent shocks in wealth? So I'm not sure what you mean by divestiture. If what you mean is individuals selling off those stocks, the important thing to recognize, in my opinion, is this kind of purely supply-side approach simply means that someone sells off a stock and then someone else buys the stock. So it just means moving the stock from one party to another. So I don't see that complete focus on the supply side as being effective. The key reason that we use fossil fuels is that there is demand for them. We have demand for energy, for primary energy in the form of electricity, in the form of fuels for motor vehicles, in the form of fuels for heating, in the forms of electricity for cooling. It's demand driven, and so we need to reduce the demand for these fuels. And that's the approach that carbon pricing, and for that matter, some of the performance and technology standards are intended to bring about. Next question, for carbon pricing to have a meaningful effect on reducing emissions, it has to be really high, above $100. It's mentioned that Scandinavian countries, as I said, have done that. But for Canada, for example, it's going to be considerably lower. That's politically challenging. Can I speak to that? Yeah, it's true that, so for any amount of carbon pricing makes a difference. Let's be clear of that. If there was for example, a $30 per ton carbon price in place, we would see very significant reductions, a $40 one. But the point at which you really begin to see a shift from fossil fuels to renewables almost across the board, and it varies in different countries, different economies, but that's when you get to about $70 to $100 per ton of carbon. It's very politically challenging to do that. Carbon pricing is going to come at a cost. But remember, if instead it was being done through a performance standard or a technology standard, it would be even more costly. So the reality is that climate change is a problem. It's a real problem, but it's going to be costly to address it. That's why it's with us. That's why it's such a difficult challenge, because it is costly to deal with it. It's very different than what we faced with the global problem of reducing chlorofluorocarbons and depletion of the ozone layer. It's very different than what we faced with acid rain in the U.S. or reducing particulates in Mexico City or Beijing. This is a challenge of a whole nother order, which is why from an academic perspective it's interesting, and from a policy perspective and a human perspective for all of us, it's very, very, very challenging. Do I think the U.S. government will continue to support the parties to the Paris Agreement for Clean Technologies? So the U.S. government is certainly not going to be making its previously pledged additional contributions of funds as part of this $100 billion per year fund that was talked about going back to the time of the the Copenhagen negotiations. So I think you're going to see much less action coming from the U.S. government itself. Even within the U.S., at the energy labs, the funding for research and development on renewables is cut compared to what it previously was. I'm going to take one last question, which is, what are the key issues in transitioning to a lower emissions economy with respect to jobs, investment, and trade competitiveness? Great question. I'm happy to end with this. It's a broad question. I'll be brief, but I'll tell you, this is a lot of what we're going to talk about during some of the sessions we're going to do at Harvard in October. So when a climate policy is put in place, it increases the costs of producing all carbon-intensive goods and services, which is essentially all goods and services, relative to their carbon intensity. That can result, if not all jurisdictions have put in place the policy, in leakage of emissions to other jurisdictions, leakage of economic activity to other jurisdictions, leakage of jobs to other jurisdictions, and challenges in terms of competitiveness of trade for producing those carbon-intensive goods and services. There are mechanisms within carbon taxes, within cap-and-trade systems. There are specific elements which can be used to address that very problem. And when I see you in October at Harvard and Cambridge, I'm going to tell you all about those. So with that, I think we're going to bring the program to a close. It was delightful to spend this time with all of you. To those of you who I will see in October, I look forward to that. But to everyone else, I hope you'll sign up for continued communication from our executive programs and, for that matter, from the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements. Thank you very much.